the way the talk is going to go is I'm going to talk about the latest book, and all of these books that you see up on the screen, What Your Food Ate and the previous 3 are very much a collaboration between myself and my husband, David Montgomery. And some people have asked, well, why is What Your Food Ate, the latest book, why didn't you start with that? And we have to say, because we didn't know these things when we started. And when Dave wrote Dirt way back when, we never envisioned that leading to he and I collaborating on other things. We didn't anticipate anything. And I know that sounds so kind of phony, because it's like, what do you mean? These things didn't just happen. But they actually sort of did. And if you've ever been on any kind of a journey or a trip, and then new ideas come in, and then they spark other ideas, and then you see things in new ways, that is pretty much what happened with us. And you never know, really, where ideas are going to take you. But for David and I, it has been a journey through agriculture and soil. And I can't think of really a better place to start with all of this than soil. Soil, in a way, is these sort of endless beginnings. And if you think back to the dawn of agriculture quite a long time ago, it's sort of odd. The more I write about and research and think about agriculture, for one of humanity's oldest endeavors, it's a little bit odd. It's both iconic and ironic. And it's iconic. We think about the plow, and we think that's agriculture, that's farming. And indeed, it always has been a part of farming, but we now know that tilling, plowing, it can be quite hard on the soil. So plowing has always been a part of agriculture. What's newer, and is sort of the other hallmark of agriculture, and these days we call it modern. I'm not so sure about that all the time, but it has to do with fertilizers, and especially overuse. There's appropriate uses for fertilizers, but too often they're overused, and that has repercussions and impacts on all kinds of things. There's a lot more on that particular aspect of things in the book. And so here we are, all these years later, some 10,000 years later, and this is what we have for modern farming, neither of which are doing the soils that people farm in much in the way of improvement or caretaking or stewardship. And yet, we keep doing it. And I'm always thinking about, when I talk with farmers, I say, why do you do things this way? And they say, because that's how my parents did it. That's how my grandparents did it. And then you realize, this is interesting. Thoughts and ideas from the past have traveled forward with us, and somehow we keep them in our minds and they influence our practices. But what we know now is that actually we can change. And I was talking with someone earlier today, and change kind of starts up here. Before we can change what we're doing down here, it's up here that we need to seed with new ideas and new evidence. So how has agriculture and farming been treating the soil? I'm afraid to say not well. You look at this map, and the areas in orange and red, as you can see, degraded, very degraded. So these are arable lands. These are the lands we rely on for agriculture. And by estimates, somewhere around 1/4 to 1/3 of arable lands are in these categories of degraded or very degraded. So I don't need to, you can see that that's a problem with all of the people on the planet and our need to eat. And so this is in part, large part maybe, why we need to begin to think about different ways of crop production, animal production, and the foods that find their way into the human diet. Now, are we bad land stewards? Are people just bad? We can have another conversation about that, but in the context of agriculture, no, we weren't looking at all to wreck soil and harm it and impair it. Long ago, when agriculture first started, We were chasing yields, and we were running away from famine. Those are powerful drivers. Those are effects that can persist through generations. So this is important, I think, to think about. These days, most of us in most places of the world, not all, of course, but we've mostly gotten past famine. And yet, it seems stuck in our mind, and it has made us focus almost relentlessly on yield, yield, yield. We must have calories. As I'll get on later in the talk, though, there's many other aspects to agriculture besides just yield and besides just calories. So this is where we were at. This is where we're at right now. Unfortunately, we are kind of mining soil. It's almost become, in a way, kind of an extractive exercise on the part of humans when it comes to agriculture and soil. Say you just walked into this tent and you saw this slide. You wouldn't need to think, much more deeply about it, because you can see that the rate at which agriculture is harming soil and it's eroding off and we're losing fertility is far exceeding the rate at which nature makes soil. So we're not going to get very far, much further with agriculture if we don't begin to turn this sort of basic mismatch around. So we don't have 500 to 1,000 years to wait to be rebuilding up the soil. That's just not a time frame that's going to work. And so this is a problem that Dave pretty much wrote about in Dirt. It's a history of farming and where that history has landed us in the 21st century. But can we reverse it, this soil loss and degradation? And if so, how do we do it, and how fast can we do it? So this is largely the story of the hidden half of nature. We found a cure for what not only ails soil, but ails us in a way as well. So the hidden half of nature is an exploration, really, of microbiomes. Microbiomes in the soil, beneath our feet, and the microbiome in our body. And these two things have some foundational parallels. And so I would have to say, with what your food ate, it's almost like you sometimes talk about peeling away an onion to get insights. It was the 3 previous books in which we were sort of peeling away the onion, and now with what your food ate, we're kind of reassembling the onion because we know about cures, we know about insights. And so this was a big part of getting a piece of the onion in place to begin to put it back together with how soil health links to crop health, to animal health, and ultimately our health. And where you really need to look to for this cure is to the botanical world, to plants, to crops. I have a favorite plant scientist. Her name is Monica Gagliano. And she has, her field of study is plant communication. And so she says, "Thus spoke the plant." And it's a fascinating area because these plants aren't just these sitting ducks out there in the soil. If they were, there wouldn't be much greenery or vegetation out there on our planet. But in fact, plants are quite ingenious. And in the context of agriculture and farming, the more we understand that plants have knowledge, that they know how to do things, even though they're in a green body, not a human body or another animal body, we should be working with that. We should not be suppressing that. We really ought to be supporting that. And so the wild and alive place beneath our feet, and that is surrounding every root system of a plant, picture it like a halo, a narrow halo around every root and root hair of a plant. And that place is called the rhizosphere. And some say this is the most life-dense place on our planet. That's kind of wild. We can't even really, right? We can't see this walking around in our day-to-day life. And I fear that it has put this wonderful wild and alive place out of our minds because it's out of our sights. But I want to walk you through some basics about the rhizosphere because it's kind of the key, in a sense, to what the botanical world and what our crops, even though they are domesticated, what they know how to do and what they can do. And what drives things in the rhizosphere are exudates. I hope you hear more about exudates from other speakers, because they're, in the broadest sense, they are meals for microbes. They are carbohydrates, they are fats, they are proteins. And plants, with their monopoly on sunshine, they can photosynthesize, and this creates an energy base for them. And they take up to 30 to 40% of their energy, and they make these exudates, and they push them out of their root system into the rhizosphere, which is the heart of the plant microbiome. And there, they're feeding trillions and trillions of microbes. And so this makes sense to me as a biologist. This is what is growing all of this life in the soil that the plant is communicating and working with. And so what we really want to think about is maybe we should focus on growing beneficial microbes in the soil, because their capabilities are vast. We don't even quite know everything that is going on between the plant and its microbiome. So I want to go into a little bit of detail about what's happening there. And so I call this whole world of the rhizosphere and the plant and the microbes, it's a biological bazaar. It's vibrant, it's intense with activity, lots and lots of things are happening. And so these exudates are flowing out. These bacteria and other microbes are consuming these exudates. And in the case of bacteria, they are excreting byproducts from their consumption of exudates. And what kinds of things? Some very helpful things. Plant growth promoting hormones. So the botanical world really has farmed out something that it needs to the tiniest creatures on Earth so that the plants can grow. Is that stupid or is that smart? I think it's smart, because these microbes have a vast genome. All of these microbes in the plant microbiome. It's not, you know, we talk about the proverbial tool in the toolbox. The microbiome is a whole hardware store, okay? Hardware stores as big as this Groundswell event site. That is what the plant is getting out of this. And so that's just bacteria. They're also producing compounds and molecules that stimulate the plant immune system. I like that. They are also, it's not just products, it's also intelligence. So compounds and molecules that are telling a plant, hey, pathogens are on the approach. It's time to gin up these other compounds and push those herbivores back. So this is what's going on. And as well, there's fetching fungi. So fungi are sort of like the miners and truckers down there beneath our feet. They can travel vast distances away from a plant, and they can fetch things. And here they are. This is their hyphae, these thread-like extensions on their body that go far, far away. And they're capturing things. Phosphorus, in particular, is a big one. Other things as well. And so it's this incessant, nonstop communication between the plant and the microbes, and even amongst the microbes themselves. Because they are doing trades, and they are doing deals, and they are figuring out how, in my tiny little one-celled body, am I going to thrive and survive to what, at their scale, is a vast, vast world. And when you're that tiny and that small, and you have a genomic repertoire like microbes do, you can do a lot when you work with other microbes and when you work with a plant. So what we know about the rhizosphere and the biological bazaar is that these are also some of the grandest symbiotic relationships that we know about on Earth. And for plant lovers, I'm one, we always marvel at, and we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't, we marvel at the coevolution between flower shape and pollinators. Because it's right in front of us, we can see it, we can see how that's working. But these relationships beneath our feet going on in the biological bazaar are every bit as co-evolved. And they actually predate pollinators and flowers by a fair bit in the plant record. Right, when plants were first emerging from these watery environments and getting themselves onto land, they were these puny little insignificant things, but they had roots and they had exudates. and they began to feed the fungi and the bacteria, and plant evolution took off from there. So what about diets? What are our plants eating? What are our crops eating? And what I really want to draw your attention to on this slide is that purple box that says good microbial metabolites. We all know, of course, especially if you're a farmer or a gardener, nitrogen is like go juice. Fertilizers are like go juice. And they indeed will make a plant grow. You can get buff biomass on top of the ground. But look at that root system on the fertilizer diet. Excuse my French, but that sucks, okay? That's not the kind of root system that we really want. Hardly any exudates are gonna come out of that. And then you get these starving microbial populations down there in the rhizosphere, and it becomes a pretty bad place to live. You get a microbiome that's, just kind of half functioning. And so that means the plant growth promoting hormones, stimulating the plant immune system, all of the intelligence that's coming up. The plant's not getting that. Contrast the soil health diet, which is rich in exudates, as well as plant organic matter, so-called residues, organic matter that's on top of the soil, because other kinds of soil life, because they will break that down, and eventually that gets down to the microbes. So this is the really sort of key thing if we think about the diet of plants and the key difference between fertilizer diet and a soil health diet. These microbes, basically it comes down to they are consuming organic matter in various forms, and that's cycling back to the plants themselves. And even when they're dead, these microbes are giving life. So this is some research that just shows about 1/3 to 2/3 of the organic matter in grassland and forest soils, it's dead microbes, all right? It's not stuff like dead roots and dead leaves. And this is kind of a new thing to think about, because lots of us have always thought, oh, it's the organic matter, it's the manures and it's the leaves and everything, and it is in part, but a lot of the nutrients are carried in dead microbes, and it cycles back and forth. And so in essence, we have a health plan for soil and crops. Now, and the benefits of healthy soil. I like everything after less. I like everything after more. I like that there's comparable yields, and I hope that farmers do too. But I think farmers are mostly interested in, it's a livelihood. They've got to be able to make a living if they are going to stay in farming. And right now, at least in the States, an awful lot of the money that a farmer brings in, it goes right back out because they're purchasing inputs. Inputs like fertilizers, like pesticides. Basically, all of those inputs are attempts to compensate for the biological bazaar in one way or another. But what if you didn't have to spend so much on inputs that's keeping more money in the pocket of farmers? And so how do we do this? This is pretty much the story behind Growing a Revolution. And there's a lot of talk here, and I'm glad to say, about regen, about practices that can actually bring soil back to life and improve its health and get the biological bazaar back up and running. And when it comes to regen, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of talk. What is it? What isn't it? What does it look like where you live? What does it look like where you live? And regen, the way I think about it, is it's these broad set of principles up here. We want minimal soil disturbance, physical and chemical, because we want the biological bazaar to function and do everything that it can do and does do. And we always want the soil covered. Erosion is not helpful, right? 1/4 to 1/3 of arable land's in bad shape. And we want diverse crop rotations because these microbes don't subsist on monoexudates, meaning just one kind of exudate. They want a diverse diet. That is what keeps them up and running, and where you can integrate animals. And so some complain and they say, I can't do this, it's too hard. My soil's too muddy, my soil's too dry. I don't want to grow more than one thing. I hate animals. I don't want to do that. It's a hassle. So there are all kinds of reasons that people can find to say this won't work. But for those innovative and intrepid farmers who have looked at these 4 principles and said, I wonder how I could make that work on my land, on my farm. And this is where farmers are some of the most innovative, problem-solving people I have ever met. Because every day is different. Every day there is a different problem out there. And every day they are dealing with these things and solving them and moving on with the business of farming. And that's why I think regen can work. This is like tapping into the DNA of farmers, in a sense, especially those that are curious, that are observant, that are hardworking, which is every farmer in different ways. This is why I think regen can work. And so this is not a recipe. These are principles, right? We all have principles in our lives as well, right? We're not going to drive fast. We're not going to, anyway, you know. So this is what it's about, and this is why regen looks different everywhere, and it's why certification and standards and so forth are quite hard. I like to think about regen. What are the outcomes that we're looking for? Definitely better soil health, a functioning biological bazaar. And to the subject of what your food ate, higher nutritional quality. And I'll talk more about that as we go on. So Tobacco Road Farm, Lebanon, Connecticut. Brian and Anita O'Hara are geniuses. These people are among the most innovative vegetable farmers I have ever met. Brian's got a terrific book out about regen vegetable production. If any budding vegetable farmers are out there, you should pick it up. He spills the beans. He tells us all his secrets for how he is applying these regen principles. And I look at this slide, I'm like, I love the diversity. I love that the soil is covered. I love that Brian is not digging up the soil every season. So they've got it wired. He is making a fair bit with his vegetable production as well. And so this is Lebanon, Connecticut. It is moist. There's been a little too much rain there in the last several summers. And that's a contrast to Singing Frogs Farm, another farm we visited for What Your Food Ate. It's clear on the other side of the country, in California, north of San Francisco. It is hotter than the dickens there. I cannot believe this. We are here in August with these photos. And anyone who's grown any vegetables, it's like, is August really the season that you think about planting or harvesting leafy greens? No, that's your spring and early summer stuff, but not at Singing Frogs. They have such fantastic soil, and these plants are so tough and so drought tolerant because of what is happening in their rhizospheres that this is what their place looks like in August. And they're smart. They keep that soil covered. Both of these vegetable farms are small, too. They're only about 2 acres or so. So you don't need 10,000 acres or 100 acres. You just are very intense and thinking a lot about soil health on these small acreages. All right, so this brings me to what your food ate and what's on the line and what's at stake when it comes to our farming practices. And there were these 4 things that in one way or another, as Dave and I are doing the research and writing for the book, we kept bumping into these things, these 4 sort of groups of nutrients. Another thing, we all really need to spread our minds much wider when we use that term nutrient. I think, again, because of the history of famine and chasing down yields, we think about calories, calories, calories. We think about protein, carbs, and fats. But those are the things we do need them, because that is what fuels our growth from a few little cells to the 30 or 40 trillion that we become by early adulthood, say 20 or so. But really, the game of life, that's just the first part of life. We got to grow that biomass, but then we have to take care of it. And that's a lot more decades than just the first 2, right? We want to be going 4 or 5, 6, maybe 7 decades beyond that. So how do we take care of all of this biomass? You know, the brain, the digestive system, all of this. This is where the Fab 4 come in. With the exception of fats, none of these things have any caloric value. Isn't that interesting? They're not fueling our growth. Where the Fab 4 come in is they're huge. They're hugely important and influential when it comes to, I know this doesn't sound sexy, but it's true. There's basic tidying and cleanup and caretaking that has to go on if our cells, tissues, and organs are going to go the long run for 6 or 7, 8 or 9 decades. And that is in part what the Fab 4 are doing for us when and if they are in sufficient amounts in the human diet. So this is what's key. Farming, agriculture in general have, depending what kind of farmer you are, they've kind of neglected the Fab 4. And this is not doing our bodies, actually, or the soil any favors. So a lot of this is mediated and modulated, the Fab 4, through the biological bazaar. That is why we want the biological bazaar up and running and functioning. And these days, we often say, super, don't we need a super biological bazaar or a super plant? No. Normal biology, folks, is great, just like it is normal. That's how great biology is in the biological bazaar. All of this stuff is synced up and wired up to just hum along, if we take care of it. So we don't need super, just normal. All right, I'm going to highlight those 4 things and tell you about a little bit of research that Dave and I did for the book. But first, just in case you don't really know what all those things are, I'm going to tell you right now. Micronutrients. So that is basically 2 things. It's minerals that are part of the rocks that our planet is made of that get weathered out of the rocks and find their way into the soil. Stuff like zinc, selenium, iron. These are the micro. That's the key with these things. We need just a little bit, but that little bit does very big things in our body, the plant body, and the animal body. So this is one kind of micronutrient. The other major kind are vitamins. We're always told, take your vitamins, take your vitamins. Well, the plant and the animal can, to some extent, depending on their microbiome, some of these vitamins are made by their microbiome. Suffice it to say, we need vitamins, again, in small amounts because they do big things. So this is why they're important to get sufficient levels in the human diet. And phytochemicals, again, thus spoke the plant. This is their language, this is their world, this is how they communicate, defend, and protect themselves. This is why, in large part, they are not sitting ducks out there, right? Long before gardeners and farmers, pharmaceutical companies and agrochemical companies were around, plants were growing fine on this planet, especially our wild plant communities, right? We weren't out there tending them per se. It's because they have phytochemicals. It's because they have their microbiome. And we need to bring as much of that ancestral plant way of life into agriculture because it's immensely, immensely helpful. Some say, domesticated plants and animals, are you kidding me? They're dumb. They need all of our help. That is not so true. We have, and plants have, phytochemicals. All right, on to this little study we did. And I do want to emphasize this was a small study. It was 10 paired farms in the US, shown there on that map. And you look across a lot of agronomic studies, and you see, oh, let's compare this thing to that thing. But what often isn't looked at very carefully is the state of the soil. You will often see, oh, there's this much organic matter in this soil and this much in this other soil. But what we really wanted to do was pin down what's the state of soil health, which is partly a reflection of soil organic matter, and is that soil health making any difference in the nutrient density of the crops that we tested? And so one thing about these farms, another time, someone gets strawberries from California and strawberries from Washington State. Oh, look, there's differences. Really, they're growing in different places. That is no surprise. You want paired farms where the thing that varies are the practices. Underlying soil type, not soil health per se, but underlying soil type is the same. So you're trying to control for as many variables as possible because we're trying to get at, do practices make a difference? So here's what we found, just sort of a summary. This is published in a journal, Peer J. There's no paywall, so if you really want to go read up on this, you can. And so those are the crops up there, cabbage, corn, and so on. Those are the crops that we compared. And what we found, soil health score. This is, soil tests typically do not look at microbial activity in the soil. Because of what the biological bazaar does, it's important that we look at microbial activity because that's how some of these nutrients and other things are moving out of the soil and into the plant. So this particular soil test that we did is called the Haney soil test. Really clever guy, Rick Haney, figured this out. And he's come up with what's called a soil health score. It's a reflection of organic matter, microbial activity. And on the regen farms, soil health scores 30% to 2.5 times higher than on the conventional farms. That's big. Well, what about phytochemicals, phenols, carotenoids, tocopherols, and so on? 15 to 20% higher? That's big. Keep that in mind when I let on what phytochemicals do in our body in a bit. Micronutrients, I like that. These things that we need in small amounts, they're all higher level, at higher levels in our regen crops. So this is why practices matter, and I want to emphasize this is a very small study, but if I see one more study on what nitrogen fertilizers do to crops, yawn, we know these things. What we don't know are the effects of soil health and practices to the degree that we need to know so we can figure this out, so we can be practicing a form of agriculture that's better for the land, the crop, the animal, and us. So we need way more research along these lines. This is just one small study. Okay, let's get to the four-leggeds, our animals. All right, there's so much confusion these days about food and what it is. So I just want to kind of clear something up. This is an herbivore, all right? And cows, goats, and sheep are special kinds of herbivores. And it has to do with this fantastic place, the very upper end of their digestive tract. It's this big, like, beer keg-shaped thing. It's why cows lumber around like this. This thing is big. It is like a compost system inside of them. And what do ruminants, their namesake comes from the rumen, they walk around all day, given, if that is, they're out on phytochemically diverse pastures, figuring out what to eat. They are not stupid, they are thinking. A little bit of thistle, but not too much. Some grass, yes, that sounds good. I need more fiber, I'm gonna go to this plant. Oh, my stomach is upset, too many tannins. I'm gonna move to this plant because I need a bit of an antidote. That is what is happening. They are not lumbering around being stupid. They are lumbering around thinking about what to eat because they have body wisdom. And there's feedbacks between the rumen and their brain and the rest of their body. And the rumen is the heart of the microbiome for ruminants. So these are herbivores. That is all they eat, is plants. Thus, this is plant-based food, okay? That is what is going on. We're just, I don't think actually we're confused. I think there's so many mixed signals out there, and there's not always accurate information, right? Lettuce is a plant food. Meat and dairy are animal foods. These animal foods came from a plant-based diet. All right, just to straighten us all out on that. And look at the metabolic terrain inside the ruminant. This is the rumen. This is an ecosystem. Like every other ecosystem, there's habitats and there's niches and there's little nooks and crannies where particular microbes do best. They are fermenting all of this plant matter. And so when the ruminant is out there in the field, laying down and they're ruminating. It takes a lot of processing. And the microbes are saying, you need to get some of this stuff back up to your mouth and chew on it, and then send it back down, and then we can get on with the fermentation end of things. So this is metabolic terrain in the rumen for the animal and for the microbiome. And when it comes to the rumen in the animal, we've all heard this term. I think it's in the Bible, fat of the land. Whoever wrote the Bible, though, we need for them to modify it because it's fats of the land. And in particular, omega-3 and omega-6 fats are in leafy and living parts of plants, not the roots, not the stalks, not the stems. And omega-3s in particular are important because in a leaf, they are what allows the botanical world, our gardens, crops on our farms, to photosynthesize. Omega-3 fats are key to the biochemistry of photosynthesis. And that is how omega-3s are entering a ruminant's body, through living and leafy plants. And that's key, living and leafy. Oh, this is part of the ruminant lifestyle, to be out grazing phytochemically diverse pastures, lots of living plants. And omega-6s are another kind of fat that is in leafy plant tissue. And there's some big differences between these fats that I'll get into in a bit, but just keep these, hold these in your mind. And what we really want is we want these, there's been so much vilification of fats as well. That's a bad fat. Really the only one is, for that is trans fats, but that's not a real fat even. But we want these to be balanced, and I think what is so convenient about biology, ruminant biology in particular, is there's a lifestyle for ruminants that can deliver a balance of omega-3s and 6s. And it's right here. It's out there in pastures because they know what to eat, and there's feedbacks all the time. So this is their innate biology. Anytime you fight with the innate or inherent biology of an organism, whether human being, plant, or animal, it's kind of the beginning of the unraveling of health. And that's why grazing it's a lifestyle, it's many other things. Unfortunately, in the US at least, feedlots are big. Why? Because we can let these animals graze for a little while, we can pull them into a feedlot, we can stuff them full of grain, and then we can send them off for slaughter and then into the grocery store. This is a huge problem for the rumen. Omega-6s are a huge problem, an omega-6 rich diet like this. And because a seed is not leafy, it is living, but it's not leafy and it's not photosynthetic. It's sitting there. It has a whole different job to do in the plant body. And seeds aren't bad per se, but they're of little help to the rumen. Some grain is okay, because of course, right, there's cows in Minnesota, and they can't be outside grazing year round. So some grain is going to make its way into the ruminant diet. But to the extent possible, we really, really want them grazing. And this is just a complete overload of omega-6s into the ruminant body. And I'll touch on that in just a bit. So what about phytochemicals, phytonutrients? This is another thing that's quite important for animals. So these researchers, they did a little meta study. They took a look at 22 studies, pasture diet versus a concentrate diet. Concentrate is stuff like grains. And they said, what is the phytochemical differences in the meat and the dairy? In particular, the phytochemicals listed up here. And what they found was the upshot was that phytochemical levels 2 to 20 times more in grass-fed meat and dairy. So just kind of keep this in the back of your mind, because this is what is making it into the meat and dairy of the human diet, if that is, you're eating animals raised on pasture. So really what we want to think about when it comes to ruminant is they kind of have this built-in health plan, and it's their lifestyle. And it's grazing on really high-quality pastures, because this is the health plan for ruminants, okay? So this is pretty good, because you can watch your vet bills go down. So where crop folks are spending an awful lot of money on inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, animal folks are spending a lot on vet bills. Feedlot and a grain-heavy diet makes an animal sick, more vulnerable to disease, and I can't tell you how many articles in the animal science world we read, most of which is, oh, there's all these problems in these grain-fed animals. We should feed them antibiotics to kill off these culprit microbes in the rumen that are creating all of these problems. Oh, we should feed them, we should get fish oil, and we should feed them fish oil, because that's omega-3s. Wait a minute, there's omega-3s out in a pasture. So it was all of these Band-Aids and things to kind of fix up animal biology when really we just need to get them back to the lifestyle that is a part of their innate biology. And so the ruminant metabolic terrain becomes our own. And here I'll transition to us. 7 of 10 of us are dying earlier than we should. And this is a huge problem because of that fact, but in the run-up to an early death, often the quality of life is not good. People are living with chronic diseases and conditions. And so what we know about many chronic diseases that are robbing us of health and life is that they're some kind of perturbed or disturbed inflammation. So inflammation is the go-to process of our immune system. It's how we fight off COVID. It's how we kill off abnormal cells. It's how this wound on my finger, people who are emailing me seeing this line, sorry, I can't type, I have a finger injury. Okay, well, that wound is healed because of inflammation and my immune system. So inflammation is a very precise, careful thing. You want it when you want it, but it needs to turn off because it's a bit like a remodeling process. And all of us have likely had damage done while the house is remodeled. And the same can go on in our bodies. So you want the remodeling and the fixing and the caretaking to be precise, to be limited in time, to start and stop. And so when it comes to our diet, this was beguiling to immunologists for a time, as they thought, oh, yeah. We know that omega-6 fats start inflammation. They're the building block. The chemical structure of an omega-6 fat is the building block for other compounds and molecules that our immune system makes. These fats are stored in our cell membranes, and our immune system goes and grabs omega-6 fats out of our cell membranes and adds other things and modifies it, and then you have these molecules put into the blood, and they travel to a wound, to a precancerous site, and they get on with their activity of inflammation, and they take care of the problem. And oftentimes biologists will, when they don't completely understand something, they'll say, oh, it just takes care of itself, or it just ends. And I mean, this was the case with the human genome. Oh, there's junk DNA in us. Junk DNA? Are you kidding me? Biology is mercilessly efficient when it comes to making things and expending energy to take care of those things. We just didn't understand all of our genome. And so same with the ramping down the inflammation process. They thought it just petered out. If it starts, it stops, right? It's only been quite recently that we've learned that another kind of fat is instrumental to shutting down, to turning that dial back to zero. And that is an omega-3 fat. Omega-6s start, omega-3s ramp it down. And so this is why we should not be vilifying fats. We should be thinking about a fat balance in animals and in us. And because we get fats in the human diet from animals, this is why it matters what our animals are eating, what their diet is. And so this is really part of a person's health plan that probably your doctor will never tell you about. But it's really important that we know these things because, again, right, thousands of years ago, we didn't have pharmacists and drugs. We had our microbiome, and we had our diet, and we had our body wisdom, which I'll get into. So what's going on with fat balance in human populations? Here we are. This is good. The Greek population prior to 1960. You want about a 1-to-1 to a 1-to-2 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. We want that balance. We do not want to be flooded with omega-6s. That is a perturbation and a disturbance, and it is inflaming inflammation in a way. But look at where we are now. This is way too high, folks. 15 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. And, oh, great, the US, #1. Actually, not quite, almost. So this is a little bit of the research that tells us, fat balance, we're not in balance. What can we do about that? Well, in part, start really paying attention to the animal foods in the human diet. Another thing that's really important is phytochemicals. Phytochemicals are embedded in the fiber of plant and animal foods, and they do many of the same things in our body and in a ruminant's body as they do in the plant body, but it's through completely different biochemical pathways and routes. And so they're essential for communication between our microbiome and our human cells. They play a big role, as I'll get into now, in defense and protection. So polyphenols are one kind of phytochemical. Many, many different fruits and vegetables. And I'm afraid to say we don't have a rumen, as much as I might want one. We don't. We are what are called hindgut fermenters. Our main microbial fermentation action is in the bottom, literally, of our bodies. It's in the colon. And this is the heart of our microbiome. It's at the end of the digestive tract. So we cannot break down the polyphenols and the fiber, and they sail through our digestive tract, and here they land in tranquil pastures. Our microbiome gets busy on fermenting and changing, in fact, fiber and phytochemicals into a vast array of microbial metabolites, one of the Fab Four. And these microbial metabolites have been found to have all kinds of beneficial effects in our bodies. I look at all those things and I'm like, oh yeah, cancer prevention, I like that. Blood sugar normalization, I like that. Controlled inflammation, all of these things. So this isn't super, friends, right? This is normal. This is what an abundance of phytochemicals in the human diet can do for us and has always done for us. So I'm not advocating a plant-based diet because plants are not going to deliver the abundance or the balance of fats that come in animal foods raised on pasture. And so we need to be thinking about, the omnivory that's always been present in our species. Phytochemicals do completely different things for us than fats, and we definitely want microbial metabolites. There's a whole other kind of a fat in animals called CLA, or conjugated linoleic acid, and that fat turns out to have many of these effects in our bodies as these phytochemicals. So we can get a lot out of our diet. And so, again, part of our health plan. And this comes from Louis Pasteur, the great French microbiologist. He and Robert Koch, the German, they fought over germ theory. These were the folks that figured out, oh my God, microbes, they make us sick. That was really important to learn, right? And that's obviously been on our minds going through a pandemic. So, one bacterium, tuberculosis. Virus, COVID-19. They thought this was all there was to disease and health. On Pasteur's deathbed, he is said to have said this: the pathogen is nothing, the terrain is everything. And that is about what is going on with our innate biology, and how is that synced up and hooked up to that of crops and to animals. And so I always think this is very important because there's never any one factor or any one thing. It's always playing out on a landscape, and sort of landscape writ large, the landscape in our bodies, the landscape, in fact, out there on the land. Okay, lastly, I want to get into body wisdom. So are we dumb and lumbering? I hope not. Like ruminants. No, we have body wisdom too, but it's a lot more complicated for us to figure out and tap into our body wisdom because we are moving through the middle aisles of a grocery store with ultra-processed foods bearing down on us, and packages and boxes, and all of that, and that's difficult. It's like running a gauntlet. We actually have body wisdom, and it's based in part on flavor. And I want to tell you now quickly about some research out of the University of South Florida a while ago. So they wondered, hey, let's, you know, everyone's always arguing about tomatoes. My tomato's better than yours. I love this one. This one has no flavor. What is going on? So the Floridade, this is a cultivar from the 1970s. Need I say more? It stores well, it ships well, it's big, it looks good. Alas, it has little flavor. So they had all of these subjects, people, eating these two tomatoes, the Floridade and this little cherry tomato, the ancestral type. And this ancestral type tomato actually is used in a lot of breeding. And this is another part of agriculture, how we make decisions about breeding in plants in particular. And everyone seemed to like the puny little ancestral type. It was a cherry. And they're like, we love this cherry tomato. It tastes so good. And so researchers are like, well, what is behind these flavor preferences? So they analyzed and analyzed. They looked at over 200 different volatile compounds that as they were chomping down on a cherry, these volatiles are released. They travel up through the cave-like terrain of our noses and sinuses, and they hit the basement of the brain, and the brain goes, aha, that is what I like, and that is what I'm going to remember, and that is a tomato you will eat. This is all unconscious, right? This is all going on in the background. And so they looked at, why do people love this puny little tomato? And it came down to these three things: fats, in particular, omega-3 fats. I find that interesting. Omega-3s and omega-6s, they're essential fats. And what that means is our body cannot put them together out of other kinds of fats. They're only available in our diet. So that is why that is important. Carotenoids are a particular kind of phytochemical that research is increasingly showing, oh, this whole thing about maintaining a biomass through the lifespan, carotenoids are super important for longevity health. And then amino acids, like some of these fats, essential. They're only found in our diet. So interesting, isn't this? 3 times more omega-3 fats in that little ancestral type that everybody loved the flavor of, more carotenoids, more of that particular amino acid, isoleucine. So flavor matters. This is what all of these receptors in our cells that are picking up on all of this stuff, in a sense, they're reading the nutrient density of the human diet a bit like data, but it's not artificial intelligence. It's actually real intelligence, okay? It's based on evolution. It's based on thousands of years of human biology and nature and agriculture and so on. And so this is why flavor matters so much. And this is why we love some foods more than others, and why we should never, ever go to the middle aisles of the grocery store hungry. Don't even bring that stuff into your house. You know what happens when it comes into the house. It gets consumed. All right, so that's the story on the tomatoes. All right, last couple slides here. So what we really know about the Fab Four is that farming practices, because of their effects on the biological bazaar, because of what we choose for animals to eat, all of this profoundly influences whether and if and at what levels the Fab Four are in the human diet. And all of those things that I just went through about what the Fab Four do, we want those things in the human diet. And it also explains why no one diet is good for every single one of us. Our diets are playing out on our own genomic backgrounds, our environmental, toxic exposures, and so on, different genders, different places in the human lifespan. This is why we have body wisdom, because it's our navigator. It's a navigator to what we ought to be eating and when. And so this was kind of the last part of the onion that Dave and I put on what your food ate, was a realization of how farming practices influence all these things that always have been an innate part of human biology and farming. And their influence on human health is just unquestionable. It's unassailable. This is what agriculture, these are the stakes. This is why we need to be paying attention to soil health and the way it ripples through the landscape. All right, and I always say, how do we get the biological bazaar up to normal in all farming systems, organic, conventional, variations in between. And this is really important because I don't like all the fights that erupt between all these different farming systems. It doesn't really help us focus on every farming system needs to think about and implement practices for soil health. So I looked up regenerative. What does that mean? And annoying definition, the first one. You're using the damn word. Don't do that. Don't do that to me. Spiritual renewal or revival. Oh, kind of like that. I've had moments like that communing with the biological bazaar in the garden. And it's hopeful. And it makes me think. And I see how I'm connected to things. This is really important. There's too much doom and gloom out there. With agriculture, with climate, and I'm not saying we shouldn't think about those things, and I'm not saying we shouldn't address them, but starting from a place of hopelessness is disempowering. And so I love this definition. Look, me and my normal. We don't need any super. Regenerative, regeneration, it's part of a normal process. It's part of the endless beginnings that are possible with soil. And so think about this. This is a place where we know that we know those 4 broad principles as they get turned into practices specific to different crops, different places on the planet, a farmer's resources, and so on. We know that this can work. All right. It's been a lot of information thrown at you, and I think if I leave you with nothing else and you're wandering around out there for the rest of the day, just remember this. What's good for the land is good for us too. That's kind of the simplest way to explain everything to you that I can think of. So I hope you hold that near and dear in your mind. All right, thank you very much. Is my mic dead? No. So there's some people leaving, so that's fine. They want to get on. Can we do maybe 5 minutes of questions? What do you think?
If anybody wants to stay for questions, they're welcome to. And if anyone has a burning question, please raise your hands.
Thank you, Joanna.
Is there anyone? Oh, hang on.
Hi, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I just wanted to ask a question about magnesium in particular.
Magnesium.
Magnesium. Can you talk to us about magnesium? Why is it that so many people are deficient in magnesium? I know you're talking about all of these nutrients and vitamins, but why in particular are we so lacking in magnesium?
Yeah, so that question, if you didn't hear it, is why does magnesium come up all the time as something that people are particularly deficient in? And I think that probably, magnesium is not exactly a micronutrient. We don't need just tiny amounts of it. So part of it is that we need fairly hefty amounts of magnesium. And if our plants, in particular, are deficient in magnesium, that is rippling through to us. So why are plants deficient in magnesium? That could well be that the aspects of the microbiome that are allowing plants to take in the magnesium are not working properly. Soils are very sensitive to pH as well, and Joel could probably tell us more about what's the pH that's needed for magnesium uptake in crops. And so what this really gets at is you start to tinker in the form of plowing and a lot of fertilizer and pesticides and so on, and we've maybe taken out or at least hampered how magnesium is getting into plants. There might be plenty in the soil, but it cannot get into the plant. So.
My question was about ruminants eating green leafy plants, and presumably in hay that has already got, you've lost the omega-3s, but I wondered in silage, is there omega-3s in silage?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is research that shows, yes, there are omega-3s in silage, a bit less because these plants are not living anymore. And silage is a fermentation process in part. And this is interesting. So the microbes involved with that fermentation are probably preserving, to some extent, the omega-3s that are in there. And we also know that some kinds of silage has higher levels of omega-3. So there's a whole rabbit hole on that. And it would behoove an animal person to get into the literature on that and see, okay, so I really need to be thinking about having this kind of silage, especially if you live in a cold climate and you can't have animals out on pasture year-round. So silages do make some difference in that.
Hi, Anne, amazing talk, and what an important seminal contribution to the entire, which fills a gap between the positive nutritional outcomes on human health of regenerative farming, because that can be a fulcrum of influence and change. My question was, what is the state of the research connecting regenerative agricultural practice to better nutrition for human beings?
Yeah, that's a $64,000 question, as they say. It's not good because modern science, modern scientists, and again, these are not bad people. They are they're a victim of research funding priorities. They are subject to how research dollars get doled out. And it's a long chain from soil health to the crop, from what is in the animal diet to the human diet. And that is gnarly, that is complicated, that is difficult to chase down. And if you're a researcher, and particularly, say you're working on your dissertation, you want stuff, clear, boom, not super complicated, not super simple. So it's a very hard thing to nail down from all of these different realms. I mean, right, you just have the crop people, the agronomists, and they're not thinking about the animal end of things. The animal people, they're thinking about the rumen and the infinite numbers of things that go on in the rumen. So that is why it's difficult. And so the state of the research is that it's not good. But here's what I always say. There's evidence, and it might not be evidence, that we could use to say, with all definitiveness, this is how it works. Nature and biology are way too complicated and variable to ever really be able to say that. What we can say, a bit like the 4 big picture principles of regen, is these are the big picture things. That's part of what we were getting at with the Fab 4. These things are big picture, and we see evidence that farming influences them, and we know the biomedical research for sure is there on phytochemicals, on fats. It's just beginning to be unpeeled on microbial metabolites. The evidence and the research on micronutrients, that's well established in nutrition circles. So it's a matter of saying, we know this big picture, and what we want is processes in farming that are feeding into that big picture. And so it's important to know the details and the reductionist science. We always need to come back out and say, what part of the big picture is this, and is it evidence for that big picture? So that's kind of how I think about it. And we will never likely, and finding out there's key things. Some things are more important than others with these higher order processes that we want in place. And so it's good to know what are these really higher order things, and this is key. And so soil health, one of those things is soil organic matter is hugely important to soil health. The types and the levels, yeah, you can go down into the weeds on that stuff, but we know an abundance of organic matter is what keeps the biological bazaar humming and thrumming along.
Thank you, Anne. There's just one more question over here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your wonderful perspective. But you mentioned that we can only get essential omega-3s through eating animals and animal products that have been raised on pasture. Is that definitive? Can't we eat other products, walnuts? Please comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. I should say as well, obviously salmon and other cold water fish are a really, really good source of omega-3s. As this person just pointed out, hey, wait a minute, what about our nuts? And she's absolutely right. Nuts and some seeds and even some seed oils are sources of omega-3. So the density and the levels of omega-3s, especially on really nice pasture-raised animal foods, is more than what we will get in plant foods. So that's not to say, though, that we need to set the nuts and the seeds and the cold water fish aside and just focus on animals, right? Because we're omnivores. And we want, frankly, as many sources. Here's how we get back to that balance. We want as many sources of omega-3 in our diet as possible, and we want to, one by one, start kicking out the omega-6 sources. And huge sources of omega-6 in the human diet, in part, the grain-fed animal products is a big one, but also seed oils, especially not all seed oils. Canola is an exception, olive oil is an exception, but most of the stuff in ultra-processed food is like a sunflower seed oil or safflower seed oil. So those particular seeds are very high in omega-6s. Sesame seed oil is oddly high in omega-6s. Fortunately, you need just a little bit of that to flavor foods. So that's kind of the story there. And there's a study that we talk about in the book where somebody actually did a sort of a model of a human diet. If you did those things, kick out the omega-6s, increase omega-3 intake. In this case, it was just animal foods. They showed that you could get pretty close to a 2-to-1, 1-to-1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s. So that's that whole story.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.